It's 6 p.m. Now, Tonight with Andrew Marr.
Good evening to you. Now, there are all sorts of mildly interesting political stories around tonight, but when it comes to what matters to you, I think there is one glaringly obvious choice: the rocketing and frankly absurd price of many basic foods. Around the world, the price of food has been falling for 11 months in a row. But today we discovered that here in Britain, it's up again by 17% year on year, and that the price rises are increasing, not falling. And if you're thinking, never mind, I'll just have a cheese sandwich tonight then, think again. According to a Which survey of 8 major supermarkets, cheddar cheese is up 28% in a year, and white bread is up 23%. So that is a pricey old sarnie. But the ludicrous price rises are much more widespread than that. Porridge oat pots are up by 65% in a year, and one popular brand of cheddar by 80%. What? And why? And potatoes and butter and sausages and instant coffee and olive oil up, up, up. And this bit is worth concentrating on. The sharpest price rises particularly affect own brand, value, or so-called cheaper foods. No wonder people are turning to junk food takeaways. But either way, inflation is higher for the poor than for the better off. Result, we've seen security labels stuck around blocks of basic cheese. We've seen staff in supermarkets having to be protected by yellow plastic barriers as they put out cut-price labels towards the end of the day. Beyond the supermarkets, the food banks have never been busier. According to the Independent Food Aid Network, 90% of the 154 food banks they surveyed saw increased demand just in the last few months, and half of them said that if demand went up any further, they'd have to cut support or turn people away. The Trussell Trust, which runs more than 1,300 food banks, says that they are at breaking point. Now, later on, I'm going to be discussing the effect of all of this on people with the lowest budgets with one of Britain's great experts on the subject. But let's start by talking to Henry Dimbleby, whose new book, Ravenous, lifts the lid on what we think we're eating and what we're actually eating. He recently resigned as the government's food czar. Henry, before we come to the subject of Ravenous in particular, these huge increases in food prices, I said just now, I don't really understand them. Why would cheese be going up by these fast numbers?
Well, so if you take cheese, the problems with cheese started last year. We had a very hot summer, which meant that the fodder crops, there wasn't much fodder, which means the farmers had to buy more crops. We had, because of the war in Ukraine, huge hikes in energy prices, which led to huge hikes in fertilizer prices. And at the same time, the farmers, with all these hikes, before the price rises came in, cut their production. So we saw prices in wholesale milk go from 30p at the beginning of last year to 50p. Your cheese, I'm afraid, is going to stay. The milk price is just beginning to come down. Your cheese, the price of cheese lags the price of milk by about 6 to 9 months, because
so it's going to stay very pricey.
So I'm afraid milk should begin to come down, but cheese will stay pricey. And the other thing I'd add, the reason it is more expensive in the value products is because there is all sorts of margin for marketing, for packaging in those premium products. And so they can actually afford to wear some of that cost, whereas the value products, if the input prices go up, the product prices go up.
So, as I was saying, given these price rises, an awful lot of people say, well, I'll just buy in some food, a takeaway food, or I'll go to a coffee shop and buy something. You might want, for instance, a handmade egg sandwich. Forget my fictitious cheese sandwich, we're on to egg sandwiches. Can you read for me what might have been in that egg sandwich? Because I was absolutely astonished by this.
Yeah, so this is for a chapter in the book, The Anatomy of an Egg Sandwich, and it was on the I was reading it idly on the train, and this was the ingredients list of this, a handmade egg sandwich. Flour, water, malted wheat grain, yeast, wheat gluten, barley malt flour, toasted wheat, salt, dextrose, soya flour, sugar, buckwheat flour, monoglycerides of fatty acids, diglycerides of fatty acids, diacetyl tartaric acid, esters of monoglycerides of fatty acids, esters of diglycerides of fatty acids, calcium propionate, vegetable oil, vegetable fat, L-ascorbic acid, eggs, rapeseed oil, pasteurized egg yolk, vinegar, spirit vinegar, mustard, xanthan gum, black pepper, whey powder, potassium sorbate, citric acid and carotenes.
I had been feeling a little bit peckish until you read that out, Henry. And of course, this is not an unusual. This happens to be an egg sandwich on which you alighted, but an awful lot of what we eat has this kind of percentage of industrial gloop, I think is the technical term, inside it.
Yeah, so the cheapest foods that we can create are refined carbohydrates, refined vegetable oils and refined sugar. Those are the cheapest calories. And a lot of processed food is basically trying to add things to those to make them vaguely tasty, and a lot of those things will make it last longer, stretch more. They'll all be there to reduce the price. But they are, in the end, most of this processed stuff, about 85% of the products from companies, are deemed too unhealthy to market to children by the World Health Organization. And in the end, that stuff, in the long term, a lot of it will hurt us, even though in the short term it will help our wallets.
And is this why, where we see these very, very sad scenes in supermarkets, people literally unable to buy the basics at the moment and going to food banks? At the same time, we look around and see so many of our fellow citizens grossly overweight. It's not a word you're allowed to say these days, but frankly, very fat.
It is. We have a real problem both with undernourishment and overweight, so people who eat enough calories but are unhealthy. So it's a terrible problem, and it shouldn't be the case that people have to go to food banks, but that is not a problem of the food system. We have used our food system to subsidize poverty. As inequality has increased, we've solved that problem by making food cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and less healthy, and that needs at some stage to unwind.
And you were the government's food czar. Is it because of the scale of the problem that you've uncovered you thought this is just too much for one person or one czar to deal with, or is it because you thought there wasn't the political will to really grapple with it?
It was because I think that there is a misunderstanding in the system. People, even those who are sick because of food, they think it's their fault and they should exercise more and have better willpower and they'd be okay. And actually, we haven't lost willpower on a societal level. And I wanted to explain how the system actually works. You can't change anything unless you can explain it. And I had to leave government to do it because it was in the explaining it. I had to explain why some of the things, they were going backwards, I thought, on health.
Yes. So probably there's nothing you can do about these eye-watering current food price increases. But where would you start if you were sort of food dictator for a day, not czar but dictator?
Well, I think that actually there are two problems with our food system. One is environmental, one is health. On the environmental side, we are doing very well. On the health side, we need to intervene. At the moment, the cheapest, least healthy stuff is the stuff that our appetite loves most. Yes. Stuff that's calorie dense, high in fat, sugar and salt. And companies market and sell more of that to us. We need to make that less attractive. We need to restrict advertising to children of that stuff. We need to make it more attractive for them to sell us healthy stuff. Because if we don't, what will happen is in the end we'll change our appetite and we'll end up, we saw that Steve Barclay, the health secretary, had commissioned a report recently saying what would it be like if we injected 12 million of the population of Britain on a weekly basis with appetite drugs, and that is not a future that I want to live in. So we need to...
Can you see a future in which government would frankly subsidise the cost of basic foods like potatoes and cheese and milk and raise the price on the highly processed, mechanically produced foods that we're eating more and more of?
Yes and no. So I think... while inequality is what it is, you have to subsidise the cost of those healthy foods for people who are in poverty. But it makes no sense for them to subsidise carrots, cucumbers for you and me, so that should be a directed target. And then making stuff more expensive, I recommended a reformulation tax on sugar and salt, which makes it more expensive for companies to put the bad stuff in the processed food. So you do need a rebalancing of those.
Makes a lot of sense to me, Henry Dimbleby. Thank you very much. Listening to that is Minette Batters, who's president of the National Farmers Union, and can I hope shed some light on why our food is costing so much more. Minette, somebody in all of this is making a lot of money. Is it your members?
It's certainly not my members. I mean, I think Henry did a really good job in outlining the challenges. And I think, one of the things is farming is a long-term business. So decisions made about planting will have been made last autumn. Contractual agreements for growers in the protected crop sector and indeed in many other growing sectors, that's protected crops, tomatoes, cucumbers, aubergines, those contractual relationships with retailers, that again will have been done last autumn. And so here we are now, things are changing a bit, but to put it into context, the average price per therm of gas in 2019 was 50p. It's still 150% higher than it was then. So you've still got these high costs of gas, which is really what drives everything else. It drives feed costs, it drives fertilizer costs, energy costs in fuel are still up. And so that is the challenge. A lot of the decisions made last year still being carried through. And I'm afraid, we're stuck with it for a while yet, if not having it baked in, I would say.
So the conundrum that I was struggling with earlier on in the show, unsuccessfully, was if world food prices are going down, as I say, I think there's 11 months of consistent fall in world food prices, why are our food prices going up?
Well, there's a big difference, effectively, in what consumers are paying. And actually, consumers are still paying a lot less than our European counterparts, for example. So in Holland, one pepper you can buy in Holland, what you can buy 3 peppers for here. So a lot of countries are passing much higher costs on to consumers. A friend of mine has just come back from the States and said that actually food prices over there are much higher than they are here. So you're right, we are seeing some commodity prices, particularly in the cereal sector. We are seeing those prices coming down, but we are also seeing consumers across the world actually paying more than we are here. So it's a complex picture. And as I say, I think it's going to take a while for things to settle down.
So, Minette, if somebody listening to the show is ambling down the aisle of a supermarket, wincing or worse at the prices of, bread, cheese, sausages, or whatever it might be, you're saying, don't blame the supermarket, don't blame the farmers, blame Vladimir Putin, really?
You had the 3 things. You had leaving the EU, that without doubt created some friction and some cost. The COVID pandemic started to see inflation rising across the world. And I'm afraid the war in Ukraine has ridden a coach and horses effectively through everything that happened before. So it's had enormous impact.
Yeah. All right, Minette, thank you very much indeed for that extremely lucid explanation. I'm a little bit the wiser, so thanks so much. Now, coming up, we're going to be looking at another very damaging day for the SNP as their treasurer is arrested by the police. It's 6:14. OK, then, staying with the subject of food inflation generally and its health effects in particular, let's talk now to one of Britain's greatest experts on the subject, Sir Michael Marmot. He's Professor of Epidemiology and Public Health at University College London. I spoke to him just a little earlier and I started by asking him what was the health impact of this level of food inflation.
It's absolutely basic to be able to eat properly and feed your children proper food. Before the cost of living crisis, we knew that people in poorer households had much greater difficulty affording food, and particularly healthy food. Then with inflation, because food and energy is a much larger proportion of the weekly expenditure of poor households, and because inflation, as you've just said, particularly hits food, it hits poorer households much more severely. So if inflation was something like 10% for the richest 20% of households, it's more like 17% for the poorest 20%. And then particular food items that are budgetary, low cost, they've been particularly hit by inflation. So that will hit poorer households even more severely.
Absolutely. Things like bread and rice and basic sausages and oil, those are all shooting up. I don't know if you think I'm making too much of this, but it seems that this is one of the reasons that's driving a lot of poorer families towards particularly unnutritious and indeed dangerous processed foods of extreme kinds.
The Food Foundation estimates that healthy, nutritious food, a healthy, nutritious diet costs somewhere between 2 and 3 times as much as an unhealthy diet. You get more calories per unit of expenditure from junk food than you do from healthy food. And what we know is that somewhere between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 families with children are hit by food insecurity. So quite apart from the problem of not being able to afford healthy food, you're hit by the insecurity, the stress of not knowing, shall I heat my dwelling? Shall I feed my children? Shall I buy the new pair of shoes that my daughter needs? The stress of just trying to manage, of getting through the week is also damaging to health.
I don't know if you've seen the pictures of blocks of cheese with security tags on them, but there seems to be something real happening in supermarkets that hasn't happened before.
It's very rare that I weep when I read a newspaper article. Well, sometimes if they're egregiously wrong, I might be tempted to. But when I read a newspaper article saying that some supermarkets were hiding baby milk formula for babies, oh my God, my blood ran cold.
Hiding because it was too expensive and they didn't want it to be...
They didn't want it to be stolen. I mean, give it away. Give it away if people can't afford to buy formula to feed their babies and infants. And so they're hiding it to make sure it doesn't get stolen. Oh, my goodness. What have we come to? And people who work, professionals who work with families with young children say that the young children not being fed proper formula, if they're not being breastfed, the interval between meals is being stretched out. My God, what are we storing up for the future?
So you'd say this is a kind of national shame at the moment, what's happening?
It's a national shame and it's a crisis. So a shame, yes, it's an ongoing problem, but it's getting dramatically worse.
Do you have any indication, this is probably more economics than your specialty, epidemiology, do you have any idea about why it's happening in Britain? Because around the world at the moment, we've had 11 months of food prices actually going down, not up.
Well, let me comment on one part of that rather than the other. So why food prices, particularly in Britain? I mean, the part that I'm not expert to comment on, we know that there's enormous profits being made in both the food sector and the energy sector. So the fact that there's a war in Ukraine and post-pandemic and so on is an excuse for the companies to make massive profits. We know that. But the second part, and I know this for energy, but because I've seen the figures for energy, but it'll be similar to food. If you look at the proportion of household expenditure that goes on energy, what you see is Britain, the gap between the poorest 10% and the richest 10% is bigger than in any other European country. That's because our poor people are really poor. They're because of the big inequalities in Britain compared with other European countries. And if it applies to energy, it'll apply to food as well. So it's inflation, but B, it's the fact that the people at the bottom end of the income distribution in Britain are poorer than the people at the bottom end of the income distribution in other European countries. So it's just much more difficult for them to make ends meet.
I see that.
And if I may, to add to that, the Trussell Trust and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation published recently the cost of essentials, food, shelter, internet access, essentials. And they said people on universal credit only get about 70% of the money needed to cover essentials. So we've got low-paid people and people who require welfare are not paid enough to cover the essentials.
Earlier on, Sir Michael, you mentioned the baby milk story. You gave a speech today in which you said that it was really important to achieve greater equity or fairness between generations, and you thought we needed action on the social determinants of health, particularly a reduction in child poverty and increased spending on children aged between nothing and 5. Can you just tell us why that's so important?
Minu Shafiq from the London School of Economics had a very interesting way of expressing this. If you look at Denmark and ask how many generations will it take for a poor person to become one with median income, average income, at the current rate of social mobility. In Denmark, it'll take 2 generations. So you get a bit richer each generation. In Norway, Finland, and Sweden, it'll take 3 generations. Social mobility is a bit slower. The US and the UK, it'll take 5 generations. In Brazil, 9 generations. The problem is, in the UK, we're heading in the Brazilian direction, not in the Denmark direction. Why? Because we have high levels of child poverty. And a second one is this expenditure on children 0 to 5. The average for rich countries, the OECD countries, is around $6,000 per child per year, is spending on children 0 to 5. In Norway, they spend $12,000 per child per year. The average is 6. We spend $4,000. What? It's not the worst. The US is worse than us. They spend $3,000. But we're limping along below average. It's reprehensible. And that means that we know what that means. It means that people can't afford childcare. We have poor quality preschool provision. It's expensive and low quality. We don't pay people properly who work in that profession. So we've got high levels of child poverty, and we don't spend money on improving the prospects for today's children.
Well, absolutely. You say in the same speech that you see a hollowing out of the public sector and something we have to address. I just wonder what your feeling is, particularly in the health service at the moment. We've seen lots of worrying statistics of different kinds in the health service, and we're seeing a fast rise in the use of private health by better off people.
If you had the hypothesis that the government was seeking to destroy the National Health Service, if that were your hypothesis, all the data that we're seeing are consistent with that hypothesis. They may say, no, that's not what we're seeking to do. But if you look from 2010, waiting lists started to increase. Not just the pandemic, not just the war in Ukraine, from 2010. So in the period pre-2010, waiting lists came down, satisfaction with the NHS was high, spending on the NHS went up at about 3.8% per year, up to 2010. That 3.8% increase per year went down to about 1% increase per year. Waiting lists started to climb and climb and climb. 150,000 vacancies for doctors and nurses. Failure to pay doctors and nurses properly. Yeah. It's a recipe for making the NHS fall over.
Are we stumbling or sleepwalking towards a privatised healthcare system, do you think?
Well, that's why I say if you had the hypothesis that this was a sort of a malicious undermining of the NHS, the data we're seeing are consistent with the hypothesis. I have no special insight into what motivates ministers, but they're not behaving as if they want to preserve our NHS. And if you go back to the Commonwealth Fund, which does regular comparisons of healthcare systems in 11 countries, the NHS always used to be number 1. And equity of access, number 1, the best performed. And we're slipping down the rankings. It's a tragedy.
Sir Michael, as ever, a privilege to talk to you. Thank you so much for joining us. And that was Professor Sir Michael Marmot, who's director of UCL's Institute of Health Equity.